So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Steve Beck is a retired director of the Sacramento Historical Society. He was historian, archivist, and educational programming director at Sutter's Fort and the California State Indian Museum from 1998 to 2018. He undoubtedly knows more than anyone else alive about John Sutter and the history of the fort. Sutter, his employees, and his fort were a centerpiece of this massive American expansion that led to the discovery of gold, the building of great cities, the destruction of the native people and their culture, and instigated the birth of a booming agricultural industry that still thrives today. Steve's forum presentation will examine the people, places, and events that carried California into modernity. Now, here's Steve Beck. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. My thanks to all of you for coming out today and all of you that are at home listening and watching, I suppose, too. Wow, what a world we live in now, huh? We were just talking about having phones with multiple lines. But anyway, it's a pleasure to talk about California history. It's been an interest of mine for many years. This is actually part 2. Did any of you hear part 1? Okay, very good. But I am in the spring. But I am going to bring you up to date a little bit to tell you where we are in the story and then continue from there. So let's see. You show me how to get those slides up, Chris. You guys might recognize I am technology challenged. Yeah, not alone. Thank you. All right. Good. So what we have on the screen is the original Bear flag. Of course, it's destroyed now. It was destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, along with lots of other incredible pieces of California history. We don't know if it was burned or melted or whatever happened, but it was in the Society of California Pioneers Museum at that time. But it was done by William Todd, unrelated to our story, but he was the nephew of Mary Todd Lincoln. And in 1846, of course, Lincoln was only a first-term congressman from Illinois, while his nephew was here making California a free and independent nation. That's what the flag represents. The star was done in honor of Texas. Texas had been the Lone Star Republic, but it had become a state December 28th, 1845, and that's what led directly to the Mexican-American War, was the annexation of Texas into the United States. And of course, the Mexican-American War includes California. We'll get to that a little bit. That ferocious grizzly bear on there was drawn by Todd. Of course, it doesn't look much like a ferocious grizzly bear, does it? No, when they raised this over Sonoma, the people that live there called it El Puerco. It looks a lot more like a pig or pork than it does like a grizzly bear. The red stripe across the bottom, and this is kind of one of the inside stories of California history. It stood for the blood that the men were willing to shed to become and keep California free and independent. Now, the story of how they got the red stripe is interesting, and it tells you a little bit about history. You know, Hubert Howe Bancroft wrote a 7-volume massive history of California. He wrote it it was published in the 1880s. In it, he was still able to interview people that had participated in the Bear Flag Revolt. He was able to interview 6 different people. You know how many different stories he got? 7. William Todd told 2 different stories at different times. But it tells you that history, as we know, is often in the eye of the beholder or in the eye of the victor, and they'll tell it. But if you read enough of it, if you read both sides, you might be able to get an answer to it at some point or another. So the time we're in, middle of June, 1846, the American Army is on its way to California because of the Mexican-American War. The Donner Party is just about leaving Nebraska at this time. So there is the biggest migration coming to California as yet, and yet war seems to be imminent in California. And that's going to get us to being able to change channels. Try it again. There we go. So the 2 men on the screen here, the one in the upper part is Commodore Robert Stockton, of course, the city of Stockton is named after him. That was done by the founder, a man named Charles Vever, who had gotten rich off the gold rush and also founded Dry Diggins or Hangtown or Placerville. The man on the bottom is Jose Castro. He's in charge of the Mexican cavalry and is essentially the hawk in the Mexican army, who wants to see Americans thrown out of California and is going to support California being a part of Mexico during the war that seems to be upcoming. Matter of fact, he's taken the time to write a proclamation that's going to order all Americans to immediately leave California. A lot of them had just gotten here, as a matter of fact. 1846 was the largest migration yet to California. About to, Donner Party had a bad time, no party. But that year, almost 2,000 other people made it to California without serious incident. And 1845, the year before, almost 1,200 people had come. Before that, not more than 200 or 300 had ever been able to make their way to California. And the first overland party to California didn't come until 1841. It was part of what was known as the Western Migration Society, founded by John Bidwell, with over 500 members. And of those 500 members, 33 made it to California. But that included Nancy Kelsey, a woman. This man is Edward Kern. He was traveling with John C. Fremont in his expedition to come to California. Now, he was working for the Topographical Corps. He was coming here to make maps of California. But you know what? He'd just done that. He was here in 1844 making maps. Why is he back in 1846? Essentially, Fremont and the men traveling with him were spies. They were here to see what the situation was like in Mexican California and to secure California for the United States if war was to break out with Mexico. Edward Kern was the only man in that group, and he was a lieutenant in the United States Army, who could make a map. Not even Fremont was a topographer, but they actually held a contest to see who the best shots were, and the best shots, literally shooting a gun, were the 63 men that traveled with Fremont to California in 1846. What's interesting about Kern is that he was put in charge of Sutter's Fort. Now, you notice I called it Sutter's Fort, and that's what people at the time called it. It was never Fort Sutter. That's something that was just made up through publications over time. It was a private enterprise belonging to John Sutter, except that in 1846, the American Army took possession, and the American Navy for that matter, and renamed it Fort Sacramento. So the only other names, other than the one Sutter gave it, New Helvetia or New Switzerland, the one people gave it, which was Sutter's Fort, that's Sutter's place, or Fort Sacramento. This is the flag that was raised over Sutter's Fort. It was raised July 11th, 1846. The American occupation of California began July 7th, 1846, when the American flag was raised over Monterey. So a couple of days later, they raised it at Sonoma, where they lowered the Bear flag. And then on July 11th, they raised it over Sutter's Fort. Now, you'll notice that there are 28 stars on this flag. The 28th state was Texas. It was annexed on December 28, 1845. The 31st state is California. Anybody know the 29th or 30th? Yeah, it's a tough one. You'd have to be from Iowa and Wisconsin. This is General Stephen Watts Kearny. He was in charge of the Army of the West. So he was charged by the United States with bringing civil government and control of the military to everything that was Mexican north of about Juarez or north of where El Paso is today. So what was now called New Mexico, California, all of that was going to be Stephen Watts Kearny's job. He had about 5,000 men when he left Leavenworth on his march south into New Mexico. When he got to New Mexico, he found there was no war. Governor Armijo, governor of Santa Fe and New Mexico, had pretty much taken the treasury and anything else he could carry and gotten out of well, I'd say Dodge, but he was getting out of Santa Fe. And he left, leaving the people for Kearny to organize. But Kearny now sees there's no war, and yet he's taxed with going to California. He reduces his army down to about 1,000 men and starts to march toward California. And then he runs into, oh, not there yet. He runs into Kit Carson. Everybody knows Kit Carson, famous mountain man. You know, they often call Fremont the pathfinder, but he should really be called the path marker because he didn't go anywhere that Kit Carson didn't take him or lead him in that case. Kit Carson had been sent by Fremont to Washington, D.C. to announce to the government that there was no need to come to California even, that he, Fremont, had secured every important position in California, had raised the American flag, and there was no war going on at all. Carson decided to stop by and see his family that he hadn't seen in 5 years in Taos before going on. Unfortunately, he ran into Kearny, and without seeing his family that was 14 miles away, Carson was forced to turn around and lead Kearny to California. They took what's known as the Gila River route, so they went through southern Arizona along the Gila into California. Well, they only had about 250 men at this point. They got to the Colorado River. It's December now, early December. At the Colorado River, it was a rough crossing, even at Needles, where the crossing point was at that time. Excuse me just a second. And Carson, and Kearny then decides to leave most of his troops, all of his artillery, most of his supply wagons, marches on with 125 men, makes a forced march across the desert. And that's not San Francisco Bay, but that's San Diego there that you see in the bay. And that's where the American Navy and Stockton are now headquartered in California, with also leaving ships in San Francisco Bay and at Monterey as well. Well, they don't think there's any war. Remember, Kit Carson told them, no need to come to California. War's over. Well, in the pre-dawn hour, any ever been to the San Diego Wild Animal Park? You've been at the site of the bloodiest battle ever fought in California history between armies. The Battle of San Pasqual. In the pre-dawn hours of December 8th, 1847, excuse me. Pre-dawn hours, December 6th, 1846. Kearny marches into the San Pasqual Valley and his scouts find a Mexican force, a substantial Mexican force, about 800 men. Kearny only has 125. They don't have extra horses. They've made a forced march across the desert. And what's the first thing the Americans do? Charge. The only guy that died from a musket ball that day was the man who led that charge. He was a sergeant in Kearny's forces. I did say it was the bloodiest battle in California history fought between armies. That's the bad news. The good news is only 21 people died that day. 19 American soldiers, 1 killed with a musket ball, and the rest killed by lance wounds. The Mexicans that were in California, the Californios as they were known, were often reported to be, in any of the original source writing at that time, the finest horsemen in the world. And of course, have you been to a bullfight before? There's a guy with a long spear, the picador. They were superb with using the lance because the lance was their job. It was moving cattle around. The hide and tallow industry was the only industry in California at that time. So they became extremely skilled at it, and they used it as soldiers. The last battle to be fought in the matter of fact, you know, the Battle of San Pasqual, that's the only battle that the Mexicans won in the Mexican-American War. I mean, of all the battles fought in Mexico proper, the only one they won was in California. The last battle was the Battle of the Mesa, fought about where Compton, California is today. I understand that's still a battleground in many ways. But the Americans formed a defensive square. You can see it very clearly in this picture. They're firing at the Mexican lancers, the cavalry that's circling them. And you can kind of see it by the artistic rendition of that one cannon blasting. That cannon is actually the Sutter gun. John Sutter acquired it from the Russians in 1841. It had found its way through a circuitous route to be a part of the American Army in Southern California. Well, the Americans pretended that one side of their square was collapsing, and I mean pretended. The Sutter gun is only a 3 to 4 pound cannon. It doesn't shoot anything very big, and in this case, it's just loaded with a bunch of stuff they call langrage, which is pieces of nail and chain and horseshoe and whatever anti-personnel material you can throw out there. And as the Mexicans noticed that the side was collapsing, Commander Flores decides to send the entire force at that collapsing side. When he does, the side truly just folds in. They roll out this gun, and the charging Mexican cavalry becomes the retreating Mexican cavalry. January 11th, 1847, the war is essentially over in California at the Battle of the Mesa. What does the United States get out of this war with Mexico? Essentially what is now the entire southwestern part of the United States. Now, at this time, the Republic of Texas is not what you see on this map or what you see on your modern maps as the state of Texas. It's essentially about 1/4 of the eastern part of Texas, and doesn't even extend all the way down to the Rio Grande River, only extends to that river right above it, the Nueces River. So that was the extent of Texas when it was annexed as a state. Now, the other parts were disputed, but still claimed by Mexico. But essentially, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ends the Mexican-American War and is signed February 2nd, 1848, the United States acquires all of the state of Texas, all of New Mexico, all of Arizona, except for the small Gadsden Purchase, which is added later, all of California, all of Nevada, all of Utah, large parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and even the panhandle of Oklahoma. Essentially, the entire American Southwest is given from Mexico to the United States, and it creates, and the idea that it was coming has led to a great deal of migration. People are writing books about it. One of these guys is a guy named Lansford Hastings. Now, when I say that name in 4th grade, everybody goes, boo. He's often blamed for the travails of the Donner Party because they were reading his book. They were following his book on their way to California. He actually was working for John Sutter. He was an attorney. He had joined Sutter in 1843, coming from Oregon, and he was being paid for every family that he could come get to live in Sutter's New Helvetia, because as people moved in, property values went up. Sutter had someone to sell his goods to from his trading center. I mean, it was a traffic jam from St. Joe to Sutter's Fort. Now, this picture was actually taken in 1853, not 1846, but couldn't find any 1846 pictures since light emulsion and daguerreotype photography were both invented in 1846. But this picture shows where the wagons going to the right and up that little hill, they're going up Galaconda Summit. The wagons going to the left are going to Gravelly Ford near Valwari, Nevada. Either way is a bad trip. It's not going to be comfortable for either. But what gets Hastings in trouble with the Donners is his shortcut across Nevada, or across Utah and the western part of Nevada. It becomes known, or infamously known, as Hastings Cutoff. Where the real problem begins is where you see that little orange dot in the Salt Lake area. It's not really anything else other than there. They built what is now Highway 80. They, the Donner Party. It took them 14 days to build a road down through Echo Canyon. Every other wagon party that went through there during the Gold Rush era got through in a day to a day and a half. But it took the Donners 14 days, debilitated the men. And by the way, you know, the Donner Party, we think of George and Jacob Donner. Jacob was 58. George was 61. George was on his 3rd family. These, you know, by now standards, that's not very old, but I can assure you in 1846, they were well on their way. What causes somebody to pack up your entire life when you're doing well. They were both leaders of their community in Springfield. James Reed, their friend who convinced them to go to California, was friends with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln had been his attorney in one of his bankruptcy hearings and stuff. So they were important people, but why would they pack up and leave? You'll have to come hear my class on the Donner Party to get the answers to that. But the point is they debilitated themselves. And yes, it was a longer route. One thing is you see that kind of thumb, where it goes all the way down. That's going around the Ruby Mountains. Where it comes back into the California Trail is located one of the finest museums of Western history, and particularly on Western migration anywhere in the world. It's the California Trail Center. It's located in Nowhere, Nevada. It's halfway between Carlin and Elko. So it's not very easy to get to, other than it's right on Highway 80. But because of Senator Harry Reid, it's a multi-million-dollar museum that is free, right on Highway 80, and has clean bathrooms. But this is James Reed and his wife, Margaret. They were really the leaders of the Donner Party. And why would they leave? Well, the reason is because James Reed here had a brother, well, actually a brother-in-law. It's Margaret's brother who had come to California in that migration of 1845 I talked about. He was one of the ones that wrote home, said, you got to come. So much so that they thought they were going to profit dramatically. So here's an example. James Reed had 6 people in his family. He had a special wagon built. I think I thought I had a picture of that wagon, but he had a special wagon built known as the Palace Wagon on the trail. That's what the original people called it who saw it. A guy named Edwin Bryant, who wrote the best book about coming to California called What I Saw in California. He traveled with the Donner Party part of the way. Then a street's named after him in San Francisco, but he stays through the gold rush. But the Donners and the Reeds are coming. So he's got 6 people. He has this Palace wagon. He's got 7 other wagons. Why does a family of 6 need 8 wagons? Because they're loaded with manufactured goods. Manufactured goods that are going to be sold at California prices. At California prices becomes a mantra of the Donner Party in many ways. This is Patty Reed. She was 8 years old when she got trapped in the mountains. This is her wedding day. She was 18 on that day. Next to her is her doll that is on perpetual display at Sutter's Fort, Dolly. She's a little less than 4 inches tall. She was a doll that was used in doll houses. So while my grandkids, bug me every day for a PlayStation 4 or something like that, the nice toys that wealthy families had in the 1840s were these large opening doll houses with dolls with movable arms. And she's still in remarkable condition that Patty maintained her in after the rescue. Of course, we're going to skip a couple of years. This is James Wilson Marshall. He also came to California in 1846. He's famous, of course, for the discovery of gold. He was working as Sutter's manager on the building of a mill in what was known as Coloma or Coloma. It was land that Sutter had leased from the local Miwok people who lived there at the time. They only leased a section of the land, not everything around it, but it was in the building of this mill that Marshall discovers the gold. This is purported to be the only existing picture of the mill. That's supposed to be Marshall in the bottom of the picture. The mill produced 2 sets of lumber where they actually ran trees through and cut them, but they were practice runs. It never produced any sellable lumber because it was during the production of the trail race. So going under, the water ran under the mill. So you can see how the mill has that lower part. That's the tail race, or also the mill race. So the water comes out of the American River, goes under the entire building, turns the big blades in there that then turn the saw blades through a gear system. Well, in order to have water rushing through to turn it, you have to have a gradient to it. So each day they would make and check the gradient to see that they had enough slope that so that they could rearrange rocks as necessary to keep the gradient. And then they would dam it up at night, go out in the morning, check to see what had shifted, and they'd let water run through it all day. They were sluicing. They didn't know it, but it was in checking the rocks in the morning after it had been dammed that Marshall found several pieces of yellow material. The biggest one he described as about the size of his little fingernail or a grain of wheat. So it wasn't very big. This is purportedly the original piece of gold that was sent by Captain Folsom, who was here with the American Army, back to Washington, D.C. This is John Sutter Jr., or John Augustus Sutter, usually went by the name August. Now, Sutter had left his wife and 4 children in 1834, and he had left them in Switzerland while he came on to the New World and ultimately made his way to California. Not a very nice thing to do, but he was in touch with his family that entire time. You know, no email in that day, so being in touch between Europe and the United States, and particularly between California and the United States, we don't know how often they were in touch, but he had encouraged his son to come to California to join him in his settlement of New Switzerland and to help him with the accounting, because John Sutter Jr. was trained as an accountant. Now, gold was discovered January 24th, 1848. Isn't that fortuitous? What happened February 2nd, 1848? California became a part of the United States. 1 week after the discovery of gold, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, which gave the southwestern United States from Mexico to the United States. So John Sutter Jr. is now arrived in California in September, and he runs into a beehive of activity. When he had left Switzerland, no gold had been discovered. He knew nothing about it. He was going to his father's farm to help him manage the farm. But all of a sudden, he's in California, and everybody's asking for money because the only way to capitalize on the gold rush is to have capital. It becomes his responsibility to organize his dad's empire. Quite literally, one of the things was that the Russians held a mortgage on the entire land of New Helvetia, which is everything from the north bank of the Cosumnes River to Yuba City, and about everything off to the sides. About 50,000 acres, 76 square miles is what New Helvetia was. Well, John Sutter wanted to capitalize on the gold rush. He knew the best way to make money was to mine the miners, not to mine the gold. But at first, gold was pretty easy to find. So he went off with some of his most trusted Indians, and he went to what we now call Sutter Creek, Sutter Hill, and he went looking for gold. He also built a store in Coloma where the gold had been discovered. And his son was tasked with dealing with all the problems that were coming to El Helvetia and all the money that was being owed or not being, paid back to them for money that was owed to them. So he's got to do something. The one thing he does have is property. His dad still owns all this land. A lot of it's been given away, but there's still a lot there. And he starts selling land, enough to pay off the Russian debt and enough to send for the rest of the family. So while Sutter did leave his family for 16 years, after 16 years, in January of 1849, they were reunited and lived together the rest of their lives till they both died. He and his wife died within a few months of each other in 1880. This is William Tecumseh Sherman. We know him as a famous Civil War general, but he's also the man who designed Sacramento. He and a man who he worked with within the U.S. Army named William Warner, they were the ones that laid out the grid pattern that is still Sacramento, all the way from Front Street to Alhambra Boulevard, which was then 32nd Street, not Alhambra Boulevard, and all the way from the American River to about just south of where Broadway is today. And, few people know that William Tecumseh Sherman, famous Civil War general, is so directly related to Sacramento. In a speech one time, Sherman told the audience, and it was later published and it's a document, that Sutter was the man most responsible for California becoming a part of the United States. The reason for that was Sutter's encouraging migration. So it was him encouraging people to come that helped bring people to California. This is the map that was drawn by William Sherman and sent back to President Polk at the time. Oh no, Polk's not president anymore. Sent back to Washington, D.C. And you can see that there's nothing on it. I mean, by golly, there's Sutter's Fort. The little building you see between the dotted lines going down to the river, that's the fishing rancheria, they called it. It later became the tanning high. That's about where Sutter landed, at 28th and C Street. And you wouldn't want to live near a tannery. So they located it far away from the fort because of the smell, or at least pretty far. The little dotted lines you see, the first one, as we're going east, the first one led to the grist mill, which is just about where we are here at Sac State. It was in the village at that time known as Brighton. And you can see the grist, and then on beyond the grist mill leads up the Coloma Road to the gold field. Now this map is from 1982, but it's based upon a map that was done much earlier. And the grid pattern it shows, this is during the flood of 1861-62, when some historians describe the valley as a lake 300 miles long and 85 miles wide. Flooding was everywhere. That's when underground Sacramento comes to be. But you'll notice the streets, how they are the same. And you know what's unusual about it, though? They weren't very clever, were they? A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. Where Sacramento's concerned, the key word in Gold Rush isn't gold. It's rush. They had to have something. There was no city. There was Sutter's Fort. There were a few buildings around Sutter's Fort. There were some ranches up the Sacramento River. There was one more ranch up the American River. A man named Leidesdorf owned that one. Across the river was another large ranch with one house on it. John Sinclair once lived about where the corner of Hurley and Fulton is today. You can actually see there were cypress trees still there until recently. So John Sutter Jr. needs money. He's selling property. He's selling it to commercial interests, people who are going to sell things to the miners. He's building a city. His dad's already building a city, unfortunately. His dad's building a city, which is a good place to build it, down by William Land Park, right along Portuguese Bend on the Sacramento River. There's some good high natural levees. You're not going to get rapid flooding. Anything left of Sutterville? Sutterville Road, the zoo, not much else, but that was going to be the city. Sutter had already started a canal to bring fresh water from up the American River all the way down to Sutterville. The East Bay Canal still follows that same ditch that Sutter had started, but no time to build ditches, no time to build a harbor where you can land ships. Remember, 90% of the people coming for the gold rush are coming by ship. They're not coming overland. You got to find a place to land that ship, to unload cargo, to unload people, and that couldn't happen in Sutterville. But it could happen at Sutter's Embarcadero along the Sacramento River. We're looking straight up J Street. That's in 1848, July 1848, straight up J Street. There are so few buildings that the barge-like thing you see in the middle of that is being used as a store because there are no stores. The one building that you see on the shore there, that's a bar. Tells you something about the ferry ride across the Sacramento River. This is 1 year later. The exact same spot. Looking straight up J Street. Notice the ships now, though. Wow, big, three-masted, two-masted, along with a couple of river schooners. Even a steamboat is in this one. The first steamboat, the Senator, to come up the American River. But what's missing? There's no docks. There's no piers. Sacramento was built where it was built for one reason and one reason only. You could land ships there. It didn't flood in 1849. It had flooded every year before then. Sutter knew it was going to flood. The Indians knew it was going to flood. They'd never taken the time to build a village there. They had some temporary summer housing, but it was going to flood. But it was the one spot that ships could be landed. So they float the ship up onto the bank during low tide, float it off during high tide, and load and unload in between. Then the ships would act as stores. People lived on them. They were hotels. But you can see they've built a huge city in 1 year. And this is 1 year later, that same city. Those aren't wagons. Those are boats. Yeah, it flooded in 1850, 51, 52, 53. Finally, in 53, they taxed the businesses. They paid to build some levees. Those held the floods back until the Great Flood of 1861-62. Sutter sold his fort in 1849 for about 7,000 American dollars. He sold it to some people who had business interests, but then it operated as a hotel. But the walls were largely taken down and the bricks were reused to build the first buildings of downtown Sacramento. For instance, the Redding and Hensley Hardware Company was located in the northeast corner of Sutter's Fort. When they bought land along Front Street from John Sutter Jr., they already owned part of the fort and the structure. They simply took their bricks and moved and rebuilt their building down along Front Street. So most of the original walls of the fort were taken down and the bricks reused. However, in 1861, that great flood of December washed away any remnants of the walls of Sutter's Fort, so that the only thing left standing was the central building. This is Peter Burnett. He was the first governor of California. He's no good guy too, but he was also the real estate salesman for John Sutter Jr. He got 25% of every lot he sold and laying out all of the city of Sacramento. So he got pretty wealthy off of it, as well as dealing with all of the problems that John Sutter Jr. couldn't deal with. This is Anna Dubell Sutter, John Sutter's wife. This is probably the best picture ever taken of her. She's often described as being very stern and very Germanic. And of course, she was from Switzerland. She never learned to speak English, even though she had been in the United States from 1850 until 1880. But she was the dame of Sutter's empire. And Sutter didn't own the fort. He had moved to his plantation on the Feather River. This is Sutter's second son, Alphonse. I tend to think this is how John Sutter looked when he was a young man. He died in a mining accident in Nevada City in 1862. This is Hawk Farm. If you have not discovered the website, CDNC, California Digital Newspaper Collection, I highly recommend that you do discover it. Look on it. It's all of the digitized newspapers of California going back to the first one in 1846. There are hundreds of articles that mention Hawk Farm. It was a centerpiece of agriculture and development in the valley. It was a stop on the steamboat ride between Sacramento and Marysville, and it was written up as being a garden community. Sutter had over 80 different kinds of fruit trees. He created a special fruit tree known as the Sutter peach. Sutter County still produces those. By grafting trees, he was able to produce a tree that could withstand the climate in California. I love this picture. This is the cover of J.S. Holliday's Rush to Riches book, and Holliday's Rush to Riches book. Man, what a jaunty bunch of guys. They're looking like they're here to have fun, and most of them didn't. Very few found gold. About a dozen men in 1848 got rich off of finding gold, and that's about it. Companies large companies to whom these guys went to work for did find more gold. I love this picture, and we're going to almost, like 5 minutes, little, okay. This is this guy, look at this. If you look at this picture, he's got a double barrel shotgun. He's got a Colt revolver. He's got a dagger. He's got a Bowie knife. He's got a hatchet, and he hasn't even left Philadelphia yet. These are the guys that came to California. You know, I guess if it was Mexican California, we'd call them gringos or greenhorns. They weren't prepared for the frontier when they got here, and they came looking for stuff, and mostly their stuff was taken from them. It was a tough time. This, of course, you are all familiar with. Sunday Morning at the Mines by Knoll. It's a beautiful painting because it says so much in just this one picture. It shows you all the different activities going on, like the guy in there writing a letter home inside the cabin, or the guys reading the Bible, or the guys on the right doing their laundry, or the guys up on the hill having a fist fight, the guys having a horse fight, and the guys that have stayed out too late. But it's a variety of people that came for the gold rush. By 1857, this was all that was left of the walls of Sutter's Fort. This is the southeast bastion. It had been operated as a cholera hospital for a while because it kept the cholera patients away from the population. But that wall caved in, it was abandoned, and later it was washed away in the flood of 61. Here's a picture of that flood of 61 up on the top. Up on the bottom is a picture I took myself, and not just a few years ago, that shows underground Sacramento. It was that flood of 61, December of 61, January of 62, that led to the building of underground Sacramento. It was raised anywhere from 14 feet to 2 feet, and the businesses themselves had to pay for the raising of their building. Huge jacks were brought in. They jack up the building. In some cases, they didn't want to pay for that, so they just abandoned their first floors. It left an archaeological treasure trove, because when the Sacramento River rushed in, it's carrying clay and silt, and it squeezed out all the oxygen, so that in those first floor rooms that were abandoned, even in some cases, paper goods managed to survive because there was no oxygen content. But other things, you know, non-paper goods did incredibly well. They came out looking almost like new as late as the 1960s, when they were starting the reconstruction of old Sacramento. Of course, the blight of the gold rush is this: the destruction of California, hydraulic mining, big monitor nozzles that quite literally mowed down entire mountains, entire hillsides. If they weren't made of solid rock, if they were made of any kind of tail, and there was lots of, you know, rivers in Sacramento, in California, geologic time used to run all north and south. There weren't any of the ones coming out of the mountains because there were no mountains. But those rivers are what left behind gold and left behind these hillsides of tailings that could then be mined by hydraulics. Of course, the hydraulics destroyed. You think this environmental, you think this be a problem, right? That somebody would stop this. They tried to stop it, but the mining interest and lobby was so strong, they never were able to outlaw hydraulic mining. So how did it stop? It stopped in 1883. A federal judge, using a federal navigation act that says you cannot disrupt a navigable waterway, claimed that this debris going into streams that washed into the Sacramento River affected that, and using the Navigation Act, they were able to stop the hydraulic mining. So, real quick, why didn't John Sutter profit off the gold rush? You think he was right there with it, because the only way to profit was to have capital. John Sutter had no capital. John Sutter's host, he owned land, he owned cattle, he had property, he controlled people. What he didn't have was cash. His wholesale goods came from Hawaii. Not a very good place to get your wholesale goods from. But Sutter didn't die destitute, as some books that have been written about him lead you to believe. In fact, the house you see on your screen, he built in 1867 in Lidditz, Pennsylvania, in Lancaster County. It was the only 3-story, the only brick, and the only house with indoor plumbing and hot and cold running water in Lancaster County at that time. That Sutter is an old man. This is Sutter's Fort. It's always been a pure tourist attraction. When even only the central building was left, this was people visiting it and taking their picture in 1867. This is a picture about 1878, right before they decided to reconstruct it. This is the reconstruction. About 70% of the bricks in the existing building are original. You can see many of them in this picture. And that's how it looks today. And by golly, that's how Sacramento looks when they built piers. The water you see off to the left side of the picture there, that's Sutter Lake. And it was an oxbow cutoff. It's where the Railroad Museum is today, but it later became known as China Lake too, because later in the gold rush, the post days of the gold rush, the Chinese community moved in there and did their businesses and stuff. And that concludes my presentation for today.
Grab that. So we're going to take one question. Go ahead and grab those. And if anybody has a question, raise your hand. Try and keep questions short if you can, but we have a couple from the Q&A and the Zoom. Vicky wants to know, how old was James Marshall when he came to California, and how old was he when he found gold?
You know, he was, I don't know the exact answers to that. He was in his late 20s. He was older than many people. He was in his late 20s when he came, and he had only been here 5 years when gold was discovered. So he was around 30.
Okay, over here.
Oh, okay. I wondered if you could speak about the Indian tribes in the area and the interaction in that period of time with the indigenous community.
Okay, it becomes very difficult. That's a long question. They are going to provide my email address for long questions, but I will address it a little bit. When John Sutter arrived and landed on the banks of the American River, he had with him himself 3 trappers, one from Belgium, one from Italy, and one from Ireland, and 10 Hawaiians, 2 of whom were women. That was the entire landing party, 13 people. 2 years later, that was in August of 1839. 2 years later, when the Wilkes exploring expedition came to California, they wrote that Sutter had now acquired about 25 white employees. Everybody else was an Indian, including the army that Sutter had. He had armed the Indians with guns he had acquired from Fort Ross, which made him unpopular with the Mexican government, but made him popular within his own community because he now had an army to defend his fort. But it was all California Indians. Now, there were no tribes as we know them today: Miwok, Nainu, Nisenan, Wintoon, Namlaki, Walaki. Those were names made up by anthropologists, particularly A.L. Kroeber, around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. There are 30 different Indian groups mentioned in the New Helvetia Diary. That's a daily log that was kept at Sutter's Fort. It's not a diary, it's truly a log book. There are 30 different Indian names mentioned as having provided labor or been to the fort, and none of them are Maidu, Miwok, or Nisenan. They're Ola Chumne, Kasamne, Makalamne, mostly something, but there are 30 different ones. And I highly recommend everyone to read the New Helvetia Diary. Sac State used to have a circulating copy of it, which is rare, hard to find. The Society of California Pioneers holds the original document, and they haven't released publication rights in a long time for it, not since the 1930s.
There's a question here. There's a question while if someone wants to get ready. There's a question on the Q&A that I've previously been told that John Sutter Jr. laid out the Sacramento grid, but you said
he hired the men who laid out the Sacramento grid. So Jr. was responsible for developing the city and saying where the city was going to be built, but William Warner and William Tecumseh Sherman were the actual engineers that laid it out. Okay. Surveyors.
Question.
Yeah, question.
Okay, I have a question. So would California have changed if the gold was discovered sooner? I know.
Well, gold had been discovered.
Yeah, it had been. Yeah.
I mean, in I think about 1840 or so, there'd been some found near Fort Tejon or near Tejon Pass. Somebody was pulling up onions and found some gold flakes at the bottom. That's a different kind of gold. That's not placer gold. That's gold that was formed when California was a big inland sea and gold sinks to the lowest spot. The placer gold is gold that eroded out of load-bearing material in the mountains and stuff. But, it should or would have. Bidwell says that he and Pablo Gutierrez, poor Pablo got hung as a spy in the Revolution of 1845, but they discovered gold on the land that was Johnson's ranch near Wheatland. Pablo owned it before Johnson did. But so I don't know how much it was a time. It was the same economic depression that drove John Sutter and thousands of other Western European males to the New World, also drove Eastern United States males to the West, looking for opportunity, looking for a new life, looking for adventure. I mean, the guys in that picture, those 8 guys, they look like they're looking for adventure and beer, but they're
Down here.
here to have fun.
Hold on just a moment, please.
How big of a piece of gold, the biggest piece that was discovered?
The biggest piece I think ever found, it was found in Australia just recently, but in California, I think it was 264 pounds, and it was found along the Trinity River in the Siskiyous. Most of the gold that was found was small, including dust. I mean, that's why they carried around these little vials all the time, where they used their knives. So the guy who wrote the best description of the discovery, because he was there, one of the Mormons working for Sutter, claimed that on their days off, they would go out and dig through the rocks with their knives looking for it. But they found it all the time, and they found it in large quantities, so that Weber and a few other guys, Sinclair, did get wealthy.
Is it true that John Sutter treated the Indians as slaves?
Well, slavery's a difficult word to define. The guy who is most responsible for that having been said later is a narrative written by a guy in dialectal German in 1869 named Heinrich Leonhardt. He said he was a slave for the American army. I'm sure I wouldn't have wanted to have been a slave. I wouldn't have wanted to have been an Indian working for John Sutter. But the other options were a lot worse. And in anthropology, looking through the anthropological lens, we can only judge people within their own times. How was Sutter perceived in his own times? Remember, Sutter's only got 13 people. And 10 of them are Hawaiians and 2 of them are women. How does he make slaves out of what is 10,000 Indians living within the confines of New Helvetia? I really can't. I'm asking that question of myself. I've never been able to figure it out. If he's really going to subjugate these people, how is he able to get them to acquiesce to his wishes without the firepower to do it? I think that Sutter was a great salesman. I think that Anashi and some of the local Indian big men were ready to accept Western goods and Western civilization. So Sutter and he were able to reach an alliance. Now, there is no dispute that the introduction of Western culture destroyed the Native American population, culture, and people in California. But, there's a couple of guys that probably get a bad name out of it. One is John Sutter, who really didn't. He just introduced Western culture to the civilization. And the other is Father Winipper Sarah, who probably loved Indians to his dying breath. But the mission system, of 21 of them, about 18 of them were nothing but slave camps. So, it's just a tough question. And I'm happy for any of you to email me. If you've got questions specifically, I have written a monograph about the controversy of Sutter and how it relates to him and where the information comes from. All of the first-hand accounts written by Edwin Bryant, what I saw in California, or written by the Wilkes expedition, people who actually witnessed Sutter paying the Indians. There's a document, the Bidwell Ledger, which was kept during the Mexican-American War, where it's of what that's being paid out at Sutter's Fort, cash paid to Indians for foraging. So I don't know. firsthand information would tell you that John Sutter, at least by the standards of his time, treated the Indians well relative to how the other people were treating them.
Okay, we're gonna have to make this last question real quick.
Last question.
You talked about a lot of people coming from the eastern part of the United States to what is now California. Nowadays, a lot of people come from Central, South America, even Africa, in Europe, and all that. And of course, most of them are coming the way the people came from the eastern part of the United States. Can you give us your thoughts about what's happening today in comparison to when people came from the eastern part of the US?
That's a really tough question. You're gonna have to do it very fast.
I'm not very good at what's happening today. I think that when people leave any place, it's because they're dissatisfied with what they have there and they're looking for a better life. They're looking for opportunity. What greets them in some cases is, hey, boy, we need you and you're welcome. And what greets them on other occasions is, wait a minute, you're not bringing anything that can help us. Get out of here. And I'm sure that's exactly what happened in California to some degree. The gold rush became so overwhelming with people coming and people who weren't bringing anything, but wanted to take everything. And that's what led to the destruction of the California Indian people and culture.
We're gonna have to leave it there. We're out of time. Let me just finish up by thanking you, Steve. Everybody give him a hand here. You
Hey,
can.
thank you guys.
Thank you.
My pleasure.